Hello and welcome to the third edition of the Signal Horizon podcast, the Brussels Signal podcast on geopolitical issues. I'm very happy that today I can welcome Marko, a political economist and, in my opinion, one of the best geopolitical commentators on X, and he runs together with Tony Nash the Cloak and Dagger. Would it be fine to call it a blog? Would it be the correct way to describe it?
Yeah,
sure.
Blog is a great way to describe it.
Which is one of the best geopolitical blogs out. It's a very new endeavor. I think it's $12 a month, and I can highly recommend it. Tony Nash also, he was the former head of the Economist's intelligence unit. He runs now Complete Intelligence, which is also a company that is deeply indebted in geopolitical analysis. And it's a great pleasure that I can welcome you today. Now, I want to start right with one of the big issues that everybody seems to be talking about, and that's what's going on with the US dollar and what's going on particularly with the Japanese yen. Like some say, well, these are just forces you cannot control. But I think, Albert, you in particularly, you sense that there is more of a political reason maybe for what's going on here.
Well, it's both a political and a financial reason. Actually, the two things, I won't say coincidentally, but they merge at this point in time. What's happening is Janet Yellen, one, wants money to flow into the U.S. markets for political aspirations, right? Secondly, Janet Yellen also wants to suppress China because, one, their economy is inflationary. Two, we're in a financial, Cold War with the Chinese over multiple trade issues and geopolitical issues in the region. Now, one of the best ways to hit China economically is to drive the yen up to 160, 170, even 190 is possible, because that sucks out liquidity from the Chinese banking sector, which puts a full stop on all of Xi Jinping's economic plans for recovery.
Can you explain a little bit the mechanics behind this? Why this would be a problem for Chinese and for the Chinese economic recovery?
Well, I mean, the yen being at 160, 170 would just drain money straight out the system and the manufacturing sector of the Chinese. Why would you go and take orders into the Chinese manufacturing sector when you can go to the Japan that has a better quality standards, better legal system, and so on and so forth? I mean, there's multiple reasons why the yen and the Japan is much more attractive when their currency is devalued to the point of being cheaper than the yuan.
Tony, you have a lot of experience when it comes to China. You have also written and commented on China quite a bit in over the last couple of years. What's your take? Do you think that this is worrying the Chinese regime, or do you think that they can easily shake it off?
Yes, I think it's worrying to them. I think they really do not want to devalue CNY. I think one of the missing elements here is Korean won. So if there is a push for depreciation of the yen and the Korean won, that puts immense pressure on CNY. And actually, if you look at the kind of more recent, say, year-to-year correlations of Korean won and CNY, it's higher even than the Japanese yen. So that, say, export competition is more with China-Korea, but with China-Japan, it's enough because socially it irks the Chinese that this is happening because they see Japan as, that competitor they have to beat. And geopolitically and militarily, they're really uncomfortable with Japan amping up its military, other things. So the currency is just a reflection of kind of many dimensions of what are happening in Northeast Asia.
But do you think that there is also a sense within China that they don't want to seem weak and therefore, for political reasons, could also not accept a weak currency? That it's not just what could be done economically, but also politically.
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, those guys. So the guys at the PBSC, the guys at China Exim Bank, the guys at China Development Bank, all the big international banks, and obviously the central bank finance ministry. There are two schools of thought. One is a kind of a more conservative school of thought, which really absolutely does not want CNY deval. Okay. At the same time, that same school of thought, and this is going to kind of be weird to some people, is that same school does not want CNY internationalization either, because they are smart enough to understand the risks of internationalizing that currency. Okay, then you have the other school that is comfortable with a little bit more CNY deval and a lot of CNY internationalization. Sorry, we've got a lot of lightning here. They understand the risks associated with internationalizing currency. So I see a lot of Westerners talk about CNY and CNY internationalization, and they don't understand that if the CNY is internationalized, there is necessarily a deval, like a significant deval of CNY. So this is the uncomfortable, I guess, dilemma that Chinese monetary folks don't want to face. And so the conservatives have really won or are winning, and I think they'll continue to win, actually.
So for our listeners, CNY refers to the Chinese yuan, to the Chinese currency. So that would kind of throw a little bit of a wrench into arguments that I'm constantly hearing about a new major currency in the system, and maybe on the long run, the Chinese currency replacing the US dollar. So based on what you just said, Tony, that would mean that the Chinese probably wouldn't even want to do this, even if they could.
Ralph, the guys who talk about a globalized CNY who sit in the US and Europe do not understand China. They just don't. Okay, they don't understand China financially, monetarily, economically, militarily. They just don't get it. So you have a lot of people advertising globalized CNY, and they just, from on paper, two-dimensionally, it looks like it makes sense. But if you want an internationalizable currency that you don't want to go to crypto, maybe they could look at the new Zimbabwe gold dollar. That's supposedly gold linked, right? A lot of these guys have said that CNY is supposedly gold linked. I don't believe that, but there are too many trade-offs for CNY to be an international currency. It just, at this point in history, it just doesn't work.
So do you think that what's currently happening, because the big player in the background seems to be the resurgent dollar, I think it's fair to say that currently in relation to other currencies, the dollar is a little bit of a wrecking ball. Do you think that on the medium to long run, or even on the short run, is this a vindication of the strength of the dollar, or is it a prelude to a potential weakness of the dollar in the future? Because I'm getting these from what I'm just commenting on the information that I see floating around, right? So I'm saying, this is now proof what's going on, that the days of the dollars are ending, and it's the last hooray of the US dollar is among us. And others argue that no, not so much, that in fact this proves that still the dollar is the dominant currency, and that everything that has been said about its demise has been significantly premature.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the US dollar is here to stay for the foreseeable future. There's no alternatives that you can even see on the horizon that would even challenge the dollar in any aspect, whether it's, liquidity, trust in the system, elasticity of the dollar. It's just, there's just no alternative at the moment. Anyone saying that this is the last hurrah is, I think, sorely mistaken at the moment. I mean, the reason the dollar is so elevated and stays so elevated is because the Treasury Secretary, which controls USD policy, has made it such where it is being used as a tool to combat inflation. Now, if inflation wasn't a problem, we'd probably see the dollar at like 92, 93, 94. But because we have to tackle inflation, that the dollar is elevated, and it's going to stay elevated for the rest of the year, probably well into 2025.
Would you argue that the current strength of the dollar is a kind of an international consequence of domestic U.S. policy, or is it domestic U.S. policy that is directly also aiming to accomplish geopolitical goals through the dollar?
I would definitely say it's domestic U.S. policy. One, to solve an inflationary issue, and secondly, to help with geopolitical issues globally, mainly against the Chinese and the Russians.
Do we have any idea who's, without naming names potentially, who's behind this? I mean, perhaps not in a conspiratorial sense, but this seems to be a very effective way to kind of strike against your competitors without firing the proverbial gun.
No, it's Janet Yellen. She's the Treasury Secretary. She controls USD policy. There's no question about that. I know that she has gone to the Europeans, specifically to the Norwegians, and said that she was going to move the dollar up and down, and that'll affect oil prices. Their sovereign wealth fund spends a lot of money in the United States, and she's made it well aware, both in China, in Europe, and globally, that she's in control of the dollar and she's going to keep it elevated.
Well, and also, there's a lot of fiscal activity in the U.S. So we can't forget that when Janet Yellen was Fed chair, she kept jumping up and down saying, we have a lot of monetary policy going, but there's no fiscal. You guys have to start spending money. There's no fiscal. There was no fiscal to offset all the monetary activity. Now that she's on the other side of it, she understands the need for fiscal and she understands the power in fiscal. And we have a lot of fiscal spending in the U.S. right now, which will, by definition, unless we're in a hyperinflationary environment, by definition, it will appreciate the dollar. That's just kind of how currencies work.
Mm-hmm.
This, of course, brings me to another question. I'm thoroughly confused, and maybe you can help me to find some clarity. How is the U.S. economy doing? I found a collection of headlines. They basically saying the U.S. economy is doing super well. The people are just too stupid to understand it. So I need your input. Is the economy doing really well and we are just too stupid? Or is it the numbers that they don't fully add up with reality?
Oh, the U.S. economy is absolutely not doing well. It's the numbers don't add up in any stretch of the imagination. Most of it is inflationary headwinds for corporations showing earnings that are better than what people are led to believe. I mean, the employment rate is certainly not what they state. They've been using illegal immigration to mask the numbers and make the labor market look a little tighter than it usually is. There's layoffs across multiple blue and white collar job sectors, and I don't understand why people think that this is a good economy at the moment. It's just inflation is rampant and jobs are being shed, slowly but surely.
I think also it's easy to look at equity markets and say, we're close to record highs. We've got earnings that are, quote, better than expected or whatever, and see that as a reflection of the economy. But and if you follow, say, on social media, if you follow a bunch of traders, they'll tell you how good things are because they're supposed to brag about their performance, right? But I think when you talk to people, they're tight, money's tight. If you look at delinquent credit, it's very high. If you look at small businesses, I think something like 47% of small businesses are behind on rent. So things are not good. And if you look at corporates, there are a number of big corporates that are in their third round of layoffs right now. They're not announced. They're not in headlines. But, these are, some of the, let's say, 10 or 20 largest companies in the world that are in their third or fourth round of layoffs now. And so, it's ugly. But when we look at, say, the GDP numbers, they're largely goosed by government spending. And so because we've had so much government spending over the last 4, 5, 6 years, pushing that back up again and pushing it up again is really what keeps GDP high. And we have a lot of people who talk about nominal GDP. We need to watch nominal GDP to see where the economy is really going. That's not really true. Nominal GDP is a good indicator of where markets are going. It's not necessarily a good indicator of where the economy is going. Because if we have high inflation, it hurts people. People can be making more money, but they're going to be spending exactly what else comes in. So nominal GDP is very difficult on the consumer. It can be great for corporate earnings, though.
Do you think this is going to have an effect on the presidential elections in the fall, that this will become politically relevant, or that there's an incentive on part of the current government, the Biden administration, either to, even though officially they cannot do this, but to, let's say, somehow incentivize the Federal Reserve to either cut rates or to even have a more expansive spending bill?
Are you saying the Fed isn't political? Is that what you're saying?
I claim it's independent.
This is this is exactly what's happening. I mean, this is an election year. The markets don't even belong in where they are right now. Everything policy-wise that's been done, both to rally the markets and show better, labor statistics, is specifically done for the election. There's no question about it. There's absolutely no question about it. And this is not some kind of conspiratorial or new idea. This happens all the time. It's just now, in this day and age with social media, it's much clearer and information gets out much faster.
Yeah.
Do you believe it's going to work?
If inflation really is where it is, when Powell spoke this week, he wouldn't be talking about slowing things down. He would be talking about holding the line, but he's already talking about slowing things down. They're already dialing back QT, a number of things. I think you asked, do you think it's going to work?
Yeah.
From my perspective, I don't know, because these things from a central planning perspective take months to come in. So, and Albert's been saying for a year or so that there will be some sort of stimulus, I think in Q2 of this year, whether it's a direct legislated stimulus or some sort of backdoor stimulus. I don't know, but if that's a Fed rate cut or if that's some sort of Treasury thing that's done, it depends on when that hits markets and who that hits. But it really, and also things like gasoline or petrol prices, that hits everybody in the U.S. and it hits people at low incomes even more. So if they can't push gasoline prices down and food prices, you can have the White House and people out of D.C. say, often, well, food inflation is only 2.1% or whatever, but people know their food bills are 40% higher than they were, say, 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. They know it, and it's frustrating and infuriating to people. And so I think that's the biggest thing. They can have as many other issues as they want, abortion or whatever, overseas wars or whatever. But the thing that's going to drive people the most is, am I better off? And can I afford to get that, that meat for dinner tonight? Or can I afford to, get whatever? It's just, that's the biggest consideration right now, at least among the people that I talk to.
Do you think that the Biden administration has it made difficult for itself, particularly if we look at their energy policies, if we look at the canceling of the Keystone XL pipeline and other issues in the realm of energy, and were they, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems that in the past they kind of turned a little bit of a blind eye when it came to sanctions on Iran and also with Venezuela, because they were hoping that they can kind of use these rogue regimes to help to push down the oil price internationally and profit from it, while at the same time making it harder or not as easy as during the Trump administration to produce energy in the United States. And now with kind of the reimposition of sanctions on Iran and I think also on Venezuela, this is probably becoming more difficult. So is it a little bit that the Biden administration tries to do two things at once? On the one hand, you want to pacify domestic environmentalists and say, no, we get off fossil fuels, no more fossil fuels. But of course, as you just mentioned, at the same time, they do know that food inflation, any kind of inflation, is connected to the prices of energy, because you need to transport that stuff, right? I mean, you need trucks, you need transportation, you need all these things to make them end up in the shelves so that you can buy them. So they kind of try now to I think Luke Roman once said, they try to ride two horses with one ass. I think there's a little bit the phrase that he used. So what's your take on this? If you try to kind of gauge a little bit the international politics and the domestic politics against each other, well, are there contradictions, or is this just something that it appears like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what's happening. Any nation, not just the Biden administration, will always look at domestic realities before anything geopolitically, and that's what's been happening. Not just in the U.S., but also in Germany, where you have the left-wing climate warriors out there pushing for all sorts of green energy and green policies, but that hampers domestic manufacturing, domestic economy across the board. The U.S. has tried to do this with Venezuela and Iran, and making sure the oil supply internationally stayed stable. But you know how that goes. You can only do that if you actually have presence in those regions and can pressure them, in which we don't. I mean, we've left vacuums throughout the Middle East, Asia, and South America that has been filled by the Chinese and the Russians, and they have no intentions on playing nice with anybody. So, of course, the oil sector, as you've seen, has gone from $72 to almost 100 repeatedly, and the Fed is forced to step in and crush it back down into the 70s just to tame inflation. But it's a give and take. I don't think this give and take is going to last very long. I mean, once the election's over, there's going to be some stark realities stark choices are going to have to be made.
Tony?
Well, yeah, I think what everything Albert says is very relevant. I guess part of what I wonder, when we look at the porousness of, say, the sanctions on Russia, part of what I wonder is, will the U.S. be able to, speaking of riding two horses with one ass, will the U.S. be able to condemn Russia and keep the war going in Ukraine and import Russian crude either directly or indirectly at the same time? I mean, I know that sounds silly, but the folks we have in power, I don't care what party they are, they're not afraid of hypocrisy. They live it every day. And so I'm just waiting for the time that we're funding Ukraine and importing Russian crude at the same time. I see that as plausible. I know that sounds really strange, but I think the hypocrisy out of DC would allow people to live in that world where they can somehow justify it. And maybe that's indirect imports of Russian crude through some sort of distilled product or refined product. Sorry, but I think that's where we're headed, because the worry about refined products and crude are so high that I think it's plausible that happens at some point.
I think we even have a historical example for this. If I remember correctly, in World War II, the Germans were buying American oil via Spain. So this would not be the first time that this is happening.
And steel. We were selling steel to the Germans as well.
Directly or indirectly. I mean, this is, do you sense, and this is, I find always a very interesting question, because there is a lot of commentary out there and kind of to try to distill or to distinguish the signal from the noise a little bit. Do you think that the US are pursuing a cohesive strategy internationally, or do you think it's all a little bit, kind of jumping back and forth and more reacting than acting?
I don't think there's any kind of cohesive strategy whatsoever with the U.S. administration. The U.S. foreign policy has been atrocious for 50 years. There's nothing new. Our biggest problem is that we have change from State Department to State Department depending on the president that comes in, and this State Department under Blinken has been an absolute catastrophe. I don't think there's been any rhyme or reason of strategy implementation whatsoever from our State Department. I don't think that we're going to have anything resembling geopolitical wins in the next 5 to 10 years. It's just we're just being reactive and trying to clean up the mess that the previous administration has left.
To be fair, we haven't really had a cohesive foreign policy since probably Eisenhower. So, I think Kennedy started the destruction of, not intentionally, but I think through different pet causes. Kennedy started the destruction of a credible State Department, and it's just withered away ever since then. And if you go overseas to embassies, the employees at State Department just are really not capable. And if you go to DC and you go to the State Department building, it's just they're not capable. And it's actually truly frightening, the lack of capability and awareness that we have in state right now. So is there a strategy? I think American strategy is executed through the private sector. That's really kind of how it's done now.
Would it be fair to say, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think it makes a good question. Would it be fair to say that, for example, Russia and China are structurally weak, but they have more of a cohesive strategy than the United States, which would be structurally strong? But the biggest strength is useless if you don't know how to use it. And so it can appear as an observer of international relations that, oh my God, Russia and China, the BRICS countries, and of course Albert's most favorite term of all times, multipolarity arising out of chaos, that it appears like this, but not because the United States are genuinely getting weaker. It's just that they don't really know how to use their strength, that there is no cohesive strategy how to apply the structural strength that the United States still have, from energy to innovation and all these other areas.
Yeah, I mean that's always been the argument. I mean, the Russians and the Chinese have always had one government, one system for the past 30, 40 years. They have a cohesive cohesive strategy that spans decades. There's no question about that. The United States does not. We have between left and right, depending on which party takes over, and it's just, that's mainly why you see these vacuums and these arguments of multipolarity come up all the time. And it's not the U.S. losing grip of the world. It's just that it's inactive or indifferent sometimes.
So I'll give a slightly different answer. I think China and Russia are better at explaining their strategy. They're better at kind of the propaganda around strategy PR. The U.S. used to have credible instruments for strategy in our think tanks and other things, but now our think tanks can be bought. I've said this publicly many times. When I was in Beijing, I saw active members of U.S. think tanks come in to speak to Chinese agencies, and they knew I was an American, and they insisted that I leave the room. And so who knows what was said? These sorts of things, right? And so, our think tanks are influenced by foreign money. And so I don't think the U.S. has necessarily we don't have a strategy that's articulated in every single area of the world, okay? I think we have a general strategy that's one of power, pretty much. I think China and Russia, because they're largely centrally planned, Russia less so, but they articulate a meticulous strategy in every part of their outlook. It doesn't matter if they carry it out. It's just the fact that they have a nice PDF that you can download and see their strategy, right? And then they pay U.S. think tankers and U.S. university people and U.S. media to say, gosh, the Belt and Road is this amazing program, right? Or whatever. And when in fact, they're terrible examples of execution of that all over the place, right? So, I don't necessarily think they're better at executing strategy. I just saw someone on social media yesterday saying that the Chinese lifted everyone out of poverty. And I'm like, okay, have you actually been to China, right? So, you really can't necessarily, these are great talking points about Chinese having a cohesive strategy. But even when I was working on the Belt and Road program, very senior people knew that it wasn't working. Very senior people would have quiet meetings with me and tell me where it was not working, why it wasn't working, and why it was going to fail. This was in 2016, okay? So these great strategies that China executes, they don't come off flawlessly, regardless of the perception here in the West.
But wouldn't you say that, if I can push you on this a little bit, wouldn't you say that a flawed strategy is still preferable to no strategy?
No, I wouldn't say that at all, because, again, when I was in Beijing, and if I would even have the faintest, remotest, slightest question, I remember being in a meeting in Beijing, and I asked a faint, slight question about a strategic direction that Xi Jinping had mentioned at a UN speech. I think it was in 2015 or 16. Someone in the room started crying and talking about how they love their president and how they love China and all this other stuff. There can be zero dissent, okay? So it's this Potemkin village of things that move along, and it's decided at the State Council, and it's articulated below, but whether it works or not actually doesn't matter. So
yeah, but Tony, you're just describing an Obama fundraiser in Hollywood. That's exactly the same thing.
But this is the thing. Politics and bureaucrats are the same everywhere. We want to think that it's different in the U.S. than it is in China, that it is in Russia, that it is in Europe. It's not. They're all clowns, okay? All of them, 100%, okay? Maybe 97%. But they're all clowns. They all think they're being effective and they're not, because they're not measured in their effectiveness. So it doesn't matter if it's a Chinese strategic program or a U.S. strategic program. They're not measured. So there's a huge portion of clownery in everything that these bureaucrats do globally.
As somebody living in Europe and living within the European Union, I could not agree more. So I think there is a lot of truth to what you're saying. But allow me to kind of play devil's advocate for a little longer.
Yeah, please.
If you look at certain areas, whether it's the resource market, the rare earth market, I think where the Chinese really play a very dominant role. or what they have done in the solar panel production, what they have done now with electric vehicles. And I assume that they probably will pursue a similar strategy with microchips. So it seems I agree with you, right? I think there are many flaws in the Chinese system for many reasons. So I fully kind of trust your expertise in this. But when they really push for a goal, it seems that they can at least get it partially accomplished.
Can I just jump
Yes.
in, Robert? I know you have thoughts on here, but I want to talk about a couple of those things. First of all, with solar panels. The only reason solar panels were developed in China at the scale that they were are because of Spanish and German subsidies that happened in the wake of the financial crisis. Those subsidies were so huge that they justified the building of massive solar panel factories in China, and then other people got on board and subsidized it. So Chinese solar panels were built with a lot of Spanish and German subsidies, a lot of Chinese subsidies, and then a lot of other subsidies as everyone else came on board. So, and then when you look at rare earths, China is not the only place on earth where rare earths are. They're in Australia, they're in California, they're in other places. It's a regulatory arbitrage. Okay, so the rest of the world is looking at China saying, hey, if you want to ruin your environment refining rare earths, go for it. You can make money. We'll even pay a premium on it. Okay, so there's an environmental and regulatory arbitrage that's going on with rare earths and has been for the last few decades. But rare earths can be developed in a lot of different parts of the world. But China's really the main place right now that's willing to, pollute their environment to get these things refined. So, I think those are things that are raised quite a lot. The solar panels, the environmental stuff, sustainability stuff was largely built on the back of European and American subsidies with Chinese subsidies, and they were smart enough to get in the game and to really, bet on it at good timing. So when the West was pulling back, China was doubling down, and so is that strategy? Maybe. I think it's good timing.
Yeah, one of the bigger issues that I like to focus on, I was going to say bigger, but definitely a proxy issue, is the danger that the Europeans have by following China into their manufacturing and emerging market sectors. I can't stress enough that the Germans blindly, specifically the Germans, right? They blindly go into supporting China in manufacturing and subsidies and thinking that the Chinese are going to start buying like they did in the run up to where they were modernizing their economy, and that's going to bring up the German economy and revitalization and whatnot. That is absolutely not going to happen in this case anymore. The Chinese have come up to standards. They have copied everything that the Germans and the Spanish and the Italians have sent out there. They're putting it into emerging markets like South America and Africa, copy German tech for 1/10 of the cost, right? And it's absolutely incredible and just naive of Europe to sit there and try to combat the United States, who is the wealthiest nation in the world by multiples at this point, right? And follow the same path that has failed them for the last 20 years. It's incredible. I saw a statistic the other day that, an American resident in Alabama, which Europe loves to use as an example of weak, small-minded country folk, is richer than the average person in the UK. Alabama. And they're not even in the top 50 of one of our states here. So, for the Germans and specifically all of Europe, stop with following China, who is stole from you for decades now, and get into trade negotiations with the United States. Focus on Africa. Focus on South America. Those are the last emerging markets where your products will sell. Not in China. They won't be sold in China. They'll be copied in China.
I think what's really important to note here, Ralph, is I have a friend who, Randy Kluivert, he's at Oklahoma State University, and he's talked about Chinese media and technology for 20, 30 years. And he's talked about how there is always a Chinese version of software. There's always a Chinese version of, say, an e-commerce company or Chinese version of an internet company. China's always gone down its own technology path. And I think what we're finding is, and we're finding it with cars now, we're finding it with other kind of manufactured goods, where in China they don't necessarily want the Western goods anymore. they want to have their kind of separated country, not just in software, not just in online stuff, other stuff. They want their own goods, and good for them, right? I think that's great. If that's what they want to do, that's absolutely fine. But foreign brands are not going to be able to use China as a justification for growth that they did 20 years ago. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to find what they need. And even if you look at, say, investment banks leaving China, right? So it's all the way from technology to manufacturing to investment banks. They're all leaving China because they realize that Chinese consumers either can't or don't want their goods, right? And so what Albert says about European companies following into China, they've been in China for 30 years or more, most of them. But to triple and quadruple down on their commitments to China at this point in history is a mistake because they're direct competitors. Sorry. And so that's the real problem and conundrum. I think what many companies in the U.S. are trying to do is channel that manufacturing to Mexico. So there's never going to be a complete isolation of China, and China's always going to be a part of world trade, always. And we want that, right? But to have some of that value add, post-COVID, people have realized that China has a lock on global supply chains, of course. This is not a new discussion. We have to have Mexico as a manufacturing center. And so, if Europe would do more of that, and they have done some of that with Eastern Europe, but it feels like there's more like this tertiary rush even into China now, especially with German companies. And I think what Albert says is absolutely true.
But this is the thing. Go on.
It's desperation on the Germans' part. They've they've suffered deindustrialization because of their green policies, and at this point, they're just trying to find any pathway to recover, and it's just pure desperation.
But this is the thing, right? I always wonder, if you want to win a game of chess, you don't have to be a grandmaster, you just have to be better than your opponent. And for me, a little bit, particularly if you look at China and Europe or Russia and Europe, that seems to apply, right? The Russians and the Chinese might not be the most brilliant strategists, but if they are better, in this case, for example, than the Europeans, they still have an advantage.
Maybe. Right, and that sort of conclusion we can't really figure out until 10, 20 years later to see the economic ramifications of it. Right, we don't know. I mean, the Chinese have made big strides, but they started from nothing. I mean, the Chinese 30 years ago was not really a functioning economy like they are today. I mean, they're a Goliath today, but like I said, we don't know yet. Right.
But I guess for me, the bigger question is this. You started the conversation asking, is U.S., say, fiscal and monetary policy mostly focused on a domestic market or a global market? And when you look at China, you have to say, is their policy mostly focused on domestic Chinese market or international market? And China has much bigger problems domestically than, say, solutions they have globally. So everything that they're doing is to satisfy the domestic market, is to bolster domestic employment, domestic resource utilization, as every country should. Every country should look after their home market first, right? Mm-hmm. And so in China, when they have relationships with Germans or the Americans or the Russians or whoever, it's 100% to focus on the domestic Chinese economy and the domestic Chinese political environment. And so, there is all these bilateral, we're friendship relationships, we need to respect each other, all that stuff. That's PR, of course, right? And so, I don't think China goes to bed at night, and I say China, if China were a person, I don't think China would go to bed at night wondering about international issues. I think China would go to bed at night wondering about domestic issues, and that's what really troubles them. So all of these things between China and Germany, China and Japan, these are all peripheral issues, like by a long shot, right? And so I think Germany goes to sleep worrying about China. I think the U.S. goes to sleep worrying about China. Why? To be honest, I don't know. I mean, we have a whole industry of people pushing China scaremongering, but I, for the life of me, can't understand why the U.S. goes to bed at night worrying about China.
But isn't it, going back to what Albert said before, like if we look at what would be possible, let's say in the Middle East and Africa, it is hard to deny, at least in the last couple of months, that the Chinese and the Russians making inroads with the Europeans, and partially if we look at Niger, if we look at Chad, where the Europeans and the Americans are retreating. And then you have kind of confusing foreign policy in Latin America, where you have the new Argentinian president who is kind of really throwing himself at the West and is, at every occasion emphasizing that he wants to be a part of the West and he wants to cooperate with NATO and he wants to kind of reduce dependency on China. But for whatever reason, the Europeans and Americans both still seem to prefer the kind of Lula types as they're in Brazil, who are openly hostile towards the West. So I find, again, maybe it's overplayed in the media, but there seems element of almost, strategic miscalculations or tactical miscalculations, if you will, on part of Europe and the United States.
So, Albert, do you remember how many bases the U.S. has in Africa? We were talking about that.
29.
Right. And do you remember how many bases Russia and China have in Africa? Together.
One.
Together they have one base in Djibouti.
One.
Right? So the U.S. has 29 military bases across Africa. Russia and China together have one. China has one base in Djibouti. So when we hear people talk about the U.S. not seeing Africa as strategic anymore, I just don't think that we would have 29 bases in Africa if we didn't think that it was strategic, right? Your attention goes where your resources go. And I think a lot of that is, I think George Bush Jr. started a lot of aid to Africa, and then Obama did a lot more in Africa. And because of those two, we have a lot of attention on Africa, which is great, right? And so I think we can talk about Belt and Road projects, which is really debt accumulation in Africa, which is great. We've had the World Bank and IMF working there for decades, okay? But Belt and Road is a make-work program for Chinese companies, and it's a way for Chinese companies to get U.S. dollars offshore. So that's really what the Belt and Road is about. In Latin America, we've got a huge amount of Latin America coming across U.S. borders right now. So those commercial relationships in people's individual homes with remittances will, if anything, solidify the relationships between Latin American countries and the U.S. for at least 2 generations. So what we've seen happen in the U.S. on the border over the last 3 years will solidify those relationships for the next 2 generations.
Isn't there a risk then that when we talk about what's also going on domestically, so you have, I think, if I put it in the most starkest terms, so you have the one side in the US Congress that says the United States should do everything at once. It's the famous you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? You support Israel, you support Ukraine, you support Taiwan, you prevent inroads of China and Russia in Latin America, you prevent inroads in Africa. And then you have the others who say, oh, no, we don't need anybody. The United States, Fortress America, we kind of pull up the drawbridge and no support for anyone. This also seems to me, I know I'm kind of harping on this topic, but for me this reflects also a little bit of a lack of a strategic sense to say, okay, what are the priorities? You set, like it was in World War II, right? You set priorities and then you execute them step by step. But there it's kind of, a lot of it strikes me as politicians are just trying to get, I don't know, on Tucker Carlson or getting a podcast deal or a Netflix series, but not really trying to formulate a cohesive approach to international politics.
So I'm sorry, Albert. I just want to. I'll make this real quick. How many cool Chinese people can you name?
Cool.
Yeah, cool. Like culturally cool Chinese people can you name?
Yao Ming.
Right. How many culturally cool Russians can you name?
Not many.
Right. So how many culturally cool Americans can you name? A ton. Right. So we have military and we have culture. These guys can spend as much as they want on infrastructure, but we have military and we have culture. And I lived in Europe for a while, and a lot of Europeans made fun of, Americans don't really have culture, blah, blah, and that's fine. But how many cool, say, Germans can people outside of Germany name? David Hasselhoff? I'm kidding. But, it's hard, right? And so I know that sounds really surfacey, but those sorts of things really matter when it comes to influencing these cultures. Albert, I'm sorry for taking your time.
But But just real quick, but Tony, now you sound like Thomas Friedman of the New York Times.
Oh God,
Right?
no.
As soon as two countries have a McDonald's, then
No.
I don't know. I mean, if you have, I know plenty of young people in Iran, and they all like American whiskey and American rock music, and they like to wear jeans. But that was also the case in 1979, and I think eating sushi doesn't make you Japanese, and I don't think that listening to Taylor Swift really makes you American.
But you know what? Being Chinese is an ethnic thing. Being Russian is an ethnic thing. Being American is not. America is accessible to everybody.
I agree with this, right? Again, you're talking to a huge fan of the United States, but I'm still not sure if U.S. soft power is what it was, 40, 50, 60 years ago.
No.
People are hypocritical, as you said before. Right? We like to consume American stuff. Let me take the best example. Everybody is on X, on their Apple iPhones, complaining about how bad the United States are, right? So nobody,
Yep.
I think, is fully aware of this. Sorry, Albert, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I mean, there's no question that American soft power is definitely not as strong as it was, coming out of the Cold War, and where everything was, the fall of the Soviet Union saw a huge uptick, specifically in rock music. That was such a big diplomacy bridge for Eastern Europe to the United States. But I don't want to get off track. But the United States goes through these cycles of interventionists, neocon warmongers, and then we're in the anti-interventionists, right? We're like, leave Israel alone to fend for themselves, leave the Ukrainians alone to fend for themselves, and those are just the winds of political change. I don't really take serious consideration into them. I like to see what the Pentagon is doing over and over again, and like Tony mentioned and pointed out, we have 29 military bases in Africa, and they're there for a reason, right? The United States has to be, to keep its superpower status and trade and maritime security intact, has to be interventionist across the globe. I know people don't like to hear that, but that's just the reality of the situation. We're the only country in the world that has a military that can go anywhere on the globe and project power in a meaningful way for political change in any country.
I agree, but if you allow me once again to push back a little bit for provocative reasons, if you look what happened in Afghanistan, right? You can be in a place for 20 years and then leave without, as if you have never been there before, right? This was a retreat almost without leaving a trace. I mean, maybe it's an unfair example, but it seems that these things can change fairly quickly.
Yeah, no, we left $90 billion of a trace in Afghanistan.
That's the
stupidest move ever.
That's a fair assessment. That's a fair criticism of the United States. That was a politically motivated blunder, to distract and scapegoat from an inflationary problem the United States was having. We left there in such a hurry and so chaotic that is absolutely disgusting, and pretty much destroyed whatever shred of trust that any ally had in the United States with the Biden administration.
Yep.
But that is what worries me, because I agree. I would even go a step further than Albert. I think that the world is going to get me lots of criticisms from our listeners and viewers. But I think that the world is a better place under U.S. hegemony than all the possible alternatives. But it's exactly things like in Afghanistan, where all of a sudden, for domestic political reasons, like with a snap of a finger, or what happened under Obama in Syria, right? I always miss I'm not saying that everybody else is playing the long game, but in the United States, the attention deficit, or kind of the focus on the short term, seems to be particularly pronounced compared to others. That might be also the nature of the political system, but that sometimes worries me. What if these short term wrong decisions accumulate and then potentially at some point become quote unquote lethal?
Well, that is absolutely a risk that's there. There's no question about that. I think we're seeing more of that nowadays, specifically on the left, where they've, used these erratic and naive ideologies to push, foreign affairs. I completely agree with you. It's a serious risk to the global order.
Yeah, I think it's possible to be powerful without intervening in every conflict globally, and I think it's time. I think the pendulum swings in politics, and I think it's time for the U.S. to kind of stop intervening in things, and we can compare any leader globally to Hitler to justify intervening in something, but the fact is they're not, and we're using convenient analogies to justify going into countries to do stuff. So I think people are pretty tired of it, to be honest. The more I talk to people who even 2 years ago were enthusiastic about Ukraine, they're just tired of it.
This would be kind of my last question, because I think it's an important one, that maybe want something to end on. But what is your take, if you want to talk about it, right? I don't want to force you to anything, on current US support, particularly for Ukraine and also in the Middle East. Just if you can give me a quick kind of roundup of what your take is on the two major conflicts that seem to be on everybody's mind.
Oh, well, I mean, concerning the Ukrainian conflict, I really believe that's more of the left's pursuit of anti-Russian bias and wanting to eradicate the Russians at any cost. I mean, they don't really care that it's Ukraine. It could have been Georgia. It could have been Turkmenistan for all. They don't really care. They just wanted to punish Russia. And I think that's where a lot of the support comes from the Ukrainian side within the United States. In terms of the Israeli side, and then you have completely a 180 where the left is anti-Israel and wants to not support anything to do with the Israeli, aggression on Gaza. It's one of those. It's actually such a complex and such a perfect example of the discrepancies within one party alone. Of like, you can support this issue, but the similar issue on this side doesn't really apply. You know what I mean? It's just the way that U.S. politics is at the moment. It's actually fascinating.
Yeah, so with what I'm about to say, we have to take the people component out of it. Okay, so I have compassion for all the people involved in this stuff. So I don't want this to sound like I'm heartless, but let's look at Ukraine. The U.S. has zero strategic interest in Ukraine, zero. Okay, there is no reason for us to be there. It's not as if Ukraine is not Taiwan. There's no analogy there whatsoever. Ukraine has a history of being a crossroads of this stuff, and we can go back to World War I, World War II, we can go back before then, go back and watch kind of Putin talking to Tucker Carlson for 45 minutes and treating him like a history student. There's a long history there. Obviously we want to help people be free, but there is not a strategic interest there. That's my view. That's been my view this whole time. With Israel, again, cutting the people out of this, Hamas and Hezbollah have been inconvenient terrorist organizations for 40 years. And I think if I take all the personalities out of it, what seems to be happening is there has become some sort of resolution to somehow get rid of those organizations, or at least disempower them on some level. So again, if we take the people out of it, take the religion out of it, take everything out of it, those organizations are very inconvenient for everyone in the Middle East, except for a few nation states that want to kind of pull those levers at times. But for the most part, they're very inconvenient for everyone in the Middle East. And so it seems to me that before this is over, those organizations will be disempowered dramatically. At least one of them will, if not both of them.
All right, on that note, I hope I can invite you again. This was a great conversation. I very much liked it, really go into the nuts and bolts. It's not just headlines, but actually talk about the strategic implications behind all of this. Albert, Marko, Tony Nash, thank you so much, and I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.